Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for another album review. Classics Week continues, celebrating 50K, Wu-Tang Clan, Enter the Wu-Tang, 36 Chambers. Wu-Tang is a still active New York hip-hop outfit that was formed in the early 90s. This is their debut LP, dropped in 1993, and it's been followed up with numerous studio albums since. But Wu-Tang is one of those groups whose debut LP kind of overshadows the rest of their albums. People usually don't give the rest of their material the time of day, even though albums like their sophomore LP, Wu-Tang Forever, are pretty good. But that's not a huge issue since every single one of the group's 9 members has released solo material, and a lot of that is as essential as 36 Chambers, like Ghostface Killah's solo stuff, which is my favorite out of all of the Wu-Tang Clan's solo release material. Fish Scale, Iron Man, Supreme Clientele, also Raekwon with Only Built for Cuban Links Parts 1 and 2, Old Dirty Bastard with The Return of the 36 Chambers, the dirty version, and of course, we can't forget the Jizz's Liquid Swords. Those are some of my favorites, but no matter how much I like those albums, this release is the alpha. This is where it all goes back to. This is where it starts, and you must start. Now, Wu-Tang and this album were an essential part to the evolving face of hip-hop in the 90s. This album is a move past the golden age hip-hop sounds that came out in the 80s, the jazz rap and socially conscious rap sounds that were being dropped by groups like De La Soul and A Tribe Called Quest in the very early 90s and late 80s, and the West Coast sounds of gangster rap that were being dropped at the time too by guys like Ice Cube and W.A. and Dr. Dre. Keep in mind, this is just a really quick, abridged version of this evolution. There are a lot more artists, sounds, and albums at work here. Because when people talk about this era of hip-hop, especially the West Coast side of things, groups like Freestyle Fellowship, for example, are often forgotten. So in the early and mid-90s, the New York hip-hop scene was reinventing itself as something much grittier, tougher, more aggressive, and ready to battle. Of course, there are a lot of individual New York MCs that played a role in that, like Nas and Notorious B.I.G., but Wu-Tang definitely stuck out and was unique in their amount of members. Not to say that none of these guys would have made it if they stayed solo their entire career, but Wu-Tang's power clearly comes from strength in numbers. Because with 9 different people MCing on these really hard-hitting, stripped-down beats, this album sort of gives the atmosphere, the feel of a never-ending cypher, a rap battle. There are a couple songs here where one MC will take the spotlight. Method Man, where Method Man is all over that song, and of course Clan in the Front, where Jizza is pretty much featured on that track. But on the majority of the tracks here, it's just one MC after another, taking turns on these beats. And because of that, it sounds like they're way more hyped than they would be otherwise. It's like a competition. It makes this record come off with just a lot of energy, and energy that is really infectious. And with tracks that have gang choruses like Ain't Nothing to Fuck With, and these really hard grooves in RZA's beats, this album has just a ton of momentum, which makes it really hard for me to just not go nuts when listening to this thing. And because most of this album sounds like a rap battle, there's a very specific kind of lyricism going on amidst these tracks. Hilarious insults, cartoony violence, a barrage of brags and non sequiturs and cultural references. There's about as much ferocity and testosterone on this thing as, like, a hardcore punk record. So there's no question that Enter the Wu-Tang is meant to be raw, rugged, dirty, and stoned. But it's music, you know, it's entertainment. There's no reason to take a lot of the violence and bragging on this LP that seriously, because it's so outlandish and ridiculous. The real goal here is just to kind of be extreme and out there, which I think is definitely highlighted on a sketch that comes before the song Method Man, where they're kind of going back and forth talking about torture. And another clear goal here is just to be clever, funny, witty. If you can get into the lyricism on this thing, you're going to hear a lot of great wordplay and a lot of fantastic quotables. And to add another level of greatness to this record, I love that every single MC on this thing comes into these tracks with a different sound and a different style. I hate it when I'm listening to a rap track and it's got 2, 3, 4 MCs on it, and they all sound the same. None of them have any flavor. You can't really pull anybody out as being any kind of specific or bold thing. Not the case here. Everyone on this album has their own angle. Ghostface Killah is the most hyped MC out of all of them. He mostly works in the upper register of his voice, throws out a lot of battle raps. The GZA is extremely cunning and clever in the rhymes he chooses. Raekwon has this nice rasp to his voice, and he pulls out a lot of vivid street life imagery. Method Man has this really kind of party time attitude. He's really chilled out, laid back, looking for a good time at every possible direction. And Old Dirty Bastard, who I think isn't the most lyrical here, but he's the most fun to listen to. He combines rapping with this really weird kind of off-key singing. Like, he's nuts. Or he was, rather. He's got this really low voice. He slurs all of his words. He's like a rabid dog. Now let's talk about the beats for a little bit, I guess. The beats on this thing definitely helped bring Wu-Tang together into this aesthetic. Of course, there was kind of a battle rap cypher thing going on amongst these tracks, but there was also a certain sound to the music behind the rapping. Of course, the name of the group is a tribute to old kung fu movies, and that definitely gets brought home in a lot of the samples and clips of dialogue from these films too. In the lyrics, there's a lot of talk of sword play and martial arts, and it really kind of brings this album a huge sense of camaraderie, like you're coming up against a gang of lyrical ninjas in a hip-hop dojo. But overall, the beats here, I think it's just kind of a case of less is more, because it's not like there's a whole lot to them. And not to say that they're not intricate, not to say that the sounds on these beats aren't interesting. I'm just saying it's definitely not like a lot of modern hip-hop, which is just saturated with a ton of different sounds, poppy, melodic, catchy hooks, R&B singers. On this thing, like a lot of hip-hop at the time, there are a ton of piano samples. But RZA didn't just pick some kind of sweet or soulful piano break or something like that. It seemed almost as if he was choosing the most sour, weird, most unused melodies, notes, and chords that he could get his hands on. Because Clan in the Front, Seventh Chamber, and Method Man all have really weird piano phrases laid into the beat. And there are even moments like Cream where all the samples come together to create something that's really kind of chilled out, atmospheric, and eerie. The drums on here have a really punchy analog sound that's really kind of typical for hip-hop at that time, really kind of classic style. And there are some songs on here that clearly sample music from the very kung fu movies that inspire the group's aesthetic too. There's just one unique sound after another in every one of these beats, and it just adds to the aggressive and unsettling atmosphere of this album. They're very textured instrumentals that just leave a lot of room and just make space for the lyrics, for the MCing. And that's perfect to me. Like I said, these beats aren't just saturated with a ton of sounds like today's hip-hop. And not to diss where hip-hop has gone. I mean, I don't think today's hip-hop is terrible. I just think it's interesting when you consider how much hip-hop has changed in the almost 20 years since this album's been released. So yeah, on this LP there are a lot of brags, battle raps, and tough personalities and beats. But it's not like that's the entirety of this album. There are some spots on here that are worth kind of thinking about the deeper meaning of, like the song Cream, which stands for Cash Rules Everything Around Me. And even though that sounds like a really kind of greedy and stereotypical hip-hop statement, that song isn't really a celebration of that. It's just kind of a really gritty picture of what it's like to grow up poor, and you're in a position where making very fast, illegal money seems like the only way out of that. And the song Tears, which comes around the end of this LP, is about friends and family members dying after making some bad decisions, like deciding to have unprotected sex with a lot of different people, or refusing to hand money over to somebody who's trying to mug you at gunpoint. 36 Chambers is definitely an aggressive album, but it's not an aggression that should make you feel threatened. It's an aggression that should get you pumped. This thing is just a messy, grimy, and unbreakable 90s hip-hop album, and there's not much more to it than that. This thing is a classic. It's an important part of hip-hop's history, but if you're not a hip-hop fan, I'm not going to promise to you that this thing is going to change your worldview if you haven't heard this album. After all, 36 Chambers is the archetype for a lot of the lyricism we hear in hip-hop today. If you haven't heard this thing before and you're just not all that schooled in 90s hip-hop in general, try this thing out and at least get a sense for where a lot of modern hip-hop's ideas come from, just to kind of hear them at their best for that time. Wu-Tang, 36 Chambers, count your chest out.
No MC you know is matching up to Caltrachesta. When I spit this flow, it's more electrical than Tesla. Send your support, please, free Cal, so I could do some shows and tour your locale. You could quote me here. My rhymes are brang dang clever. I'm saying it now, but you'll be saying it forever.